Hi, today we're going to be talking about resumes and interviews. And to begin, why are we talking about this in MS2? The reason is because much of this pre-professional content or just professionalism content used to be in later courses, but students did not like that the pathophysiology was kind of front loaded, and then a lot of that professionalism stuff was pushed to the back, either because some people struggle with one or the other. And so we try to sprinkle it more throughout the entire program, right? So it might seem a little soon to be going over resumes and interviews because y'all are still a bit away from graduating. But having said that, this is here just to, again, help balance that load, and that if you have any questions as you get closer to graduation or after you graduate about writing a resume or interviewing effectively, feel free to reach out to me. I'm sure other instructors would also be happy to help you with that, but I make the offer just because I am teaching the content, right? So I feel like I kind of owe you, but I'm sure other instructors would also be happy to help you. So the first thing about sending a resume or interview is a cover letter. So a cover letter isn't always required, but it oftentimes is when you apply for a job. The cover letter is a formal introduction to the employer. It's basically a way of saying, hey, my name's Ranson. Here's why I'm interested in this job, and here's why I think I'd be a good fit. You don't want to just copy what somebody else has written. You will find for a lot of these things, there are formats or templates that people use online. You want to try to personalize it. You want to address it to a single person. You might not always know who that person is, so you can say something like, to whom it may concern, or to the manager or the, human resources at whatever place. But oftentimes you're going to know who it is. Like if you're applying for a specific position on a specific unit, you'll probably have met or talked to, or at least be able to find out who the manager is on that nursing unit. And so you could send it to them, but it'll depend place to place. Part of the idea here is that it helps showcase your writing ability. And again, it also just kind of helps introduce yourself in a little less formal way. The resume isn't really a great indication of who you are always. It's kind of just almost like bullet points. But this is a good way again to kind of display your writing ability and also maybe make it a little bit more personalized because it's kind of gives your unique writing voice, as an example to the person you're applying for. You don't want it to be more than a page. I always say you want to think of it like a three-paragraph essay if you remember doing those in grade school. And my dad always used to say that the key to a three-paragraph essay is the first paragraph, you tell them what you're going to tell them. The second paragraph, you tell them. And the third paragraph, you tell them what you told them, right? So if that helps, that's kind of the structure. You have an intro, the body, and the summary or the conclusion, right? So again, these aren't super long, but yeah, you send them to your employer, and they should also be somewhat tailored to the specific place you're applying. So if you're applying to multiple places, you're probably going to need to send out multiple cover letters, but a large part of them might be the same, but you might want to make a couple changes to kind of suit the place you're applying to. So then the resume itself, right? So again, you might not need a cover letter, but oftentimes cover letter is useful. The resume, what I've noticed a lot is that people tend to overdo these. If you've ever seen somebody put at the top, like, "Hi, my name is, Ranson, and I'm a nurse educator, and I really like this and that and the other." That's the kind of thing that actually should be more in a cover letter. Again, it's not the end of the world if you put it in a resume. All of these things are just guidelines. They're probably not going to be the thing that prevents you from getting a job, but if you're applying for a position, there's a lot of competition. You have managers that are looking over a lot of different portfolios, a lot of different resumes. And so it helps to make yours punchy, concise, clear, organized. Because if it's just kind of a rambling, meandering mess, yeah, they might not even look at it, especially if you haven't met the person that you're, applying to work for in person yet. So the first thing you want to have is your contact information. So that's just your basic like phone number, email, maybe address, ways they can reach you. You want to then list your education. And again, you don't have to put this in this order. This just seems to be, to me, yeah, the most clear way and straightforward way to do it. Your education. Um, so you can include things like maybe your high school, your college, if you have any college, you want to always list your highest degree. For some of you, for your educational work experience, you're not going to have much. And for some of you, you're going to have a lot, just depending on where you are at in your life when you're coming through the program. So if you don't have much in the way of education, like maybe this is your first degree at all, um, you might want to find ways to expand it out. So you could maybe put like what clinical floors you did your clinical rotations on, right? And kind of like explain what you did during that time. It might be a way to kind of showcase like, hey, here's where I've had ex some experience. You might want to put like where you went to high school and maybe any superlatives or, awards or special things you got. Maybe if it was really high, like your ACT or SAT scores or something like that. But if you already have, a bachelor's degree or even a AA from before this, you probably don't need to include your high school degree. You'd probably just include that. But again, it's up to you. Your work experience, again, you want to really just include your most recent or your most relevant. For some of y'all, you don't have any work experience, and that's okay. That just means you want to focus on kind of beefing up your education. For those of y'all that have had very little work experience, I would just probably include all of it. Like maybe you've had two jobs and you were working as like a server at a restaurant or something. I would just put both of those. And if you think, well, that's not really relevant, I would say it is. I think nursing is half providing nursing care to people and half, you know, being a waiter or waitress, getting people what they want and listening to them complain and stuff. Not always, but in a lot of situations it can feel like that. So if nothing else, it does actually demonstrate that you have interpersonal skills, right? Though some of y'all maybe have had 10, 20 jobs over your career. And so in that case, I would say you just include your most recent or the ones that are most relevant to the position you're applying for. You don't want to include every single job you've ever had. That's going to be under your work history, which is a separate document. And again, in some cases, your resume will be your entire work experience. For example, mine, I've worked at two places, UF Health and then here at Santa Fe. And so for that reason, they was worked in multiple different roles in those organizations and different positions, but really just those two places. And so I can keep it concise to just those two things. But those of y'all that have had a lot, so I include all of it. But if you've had a lot of other jobs, you might want to only kind of whittle it down to the things that are most important. You want to include your certifications and licensing. So things like your BLS certification, if you have ACLS, your nursing license, once you get it, all those kinds of things. Um, that's something good. If you have any others that are maybe even outside the discipline, it can be useful. Professional organizations you're a member of. So yeah, again, like if you were in Student Nursing Association, something to include, or Florida Nursing Association, or ANA, or anything like that, any kind of professional organization, you might want to include that. Community or volunteer work can also be a way to kind of bridge the gap if you don't have a lot of education or work experience. It can also be something to kind of highlight that other attributes or values you have. The one thing I would say to be careful of is sometimes community or volunteer work, if you put it, it might reveal things that you might not want revealed about yourself to your employer. So it could be like your religious affiliation, or sometimes maybe even like your, personal beliefs or your political beliefs or something like that. Not always, but there are situations where it might reveal that. And if you don't feel comfortable revealing it to employer, don't put it in your resume. But sometimes those things can be useful to include because they demonstrate, abilities to organize activities outside of work, or that you have a skill set that while it's outside of work, it could be transferable into your job, right? A general rule for your resume is you want to keep it to one page. Again, you don't have to follow that. A lot of people don't, but if I was you, I would keep it to one page. I've known HR individual people that work at HR and other companies, and some in nursing, some outside of nursing, but they basically have said like if it's over a page, I just don't even look at it because they don't really understand what a resume is. So again, I'm not saying that's the case. I've also known a lot of managers and stuff who don't care about that, but it's just something to keep in mind. Generally, the rule is like a page. If it needs to be over a page, then you're probably looking more at writing something called a curriculum vitae or CV, which we'll talk about in a second. But really, the idea is that a resume is supposed to be kind of the idea is that it's supposed to be a one-page summary of your skills and abilities, right? So again, you want to try to keep it short and succinct, not overly descriptive, and you want to try to keep it organized. And you want to try to make it look as nice as you can. So there's a lot of ways you could format it, and again, if you look online, there's like a lot of ideas you could probably find, or even forms. But yeah, That's kind of the general rule or rules. So a curriculum vitae or a CV, this is a document that's much longer. And this would be something where you would list like, a lot more information, like maybe more jobs or more education you've had. But the difference is a CV is mainly used in academia, like the field of academia and research. So, like I teach nursing here at Santa Fe. My title's like a professor of nursing here. So I keep a CV, and in that CV, it lists all the things that are in my resume, but then more so. So it also lists every single course I've ever taught, which that means every section I've ever taught. So if you think, that you're taking MedSurg 2, I've taught in MedSurg 2 courses for at time of this recording, 11 years, and there's two a year, so 22 MedSurg 2 courses. But it's not just MedSurg 2 I've taught in, I've also taught in MedSurg 1 and a lot of other courses. So my curriculum vitae is very long because it lists all those in the semesters and which term it was and everything. But the reason is because I'm trying to demonstrate that I have extensive teaching experience, right, in this curriculum, right? So that if I was applying for a job at another academic institution, they would show that like, look, these are the number of courses I've managed, these are the number of courses I've taught in, etc. If I was published in any research articles or had, written any research articles, which I have not, but if I had, I would include that as well. So I'd list any like published articles I've had, etc. If I've been involved in any research that maybe I didn't write for, but maybe I like contributed something to, I'd list that, anything like that. I might also list more academic or professional achievements that I might not put in a resume. So, if there's any specific awards or acknowledgments or honors or something like that you've gotten in academia, either as a student or as a teacher or something, you might include that. Again, these are a lot longer as a result. And you still want to try to keep it organized and looking good. But again, this is mainly just used in academia. So the one time you might have to submit a CV is if you apply to a bachelor's program or especially like any kind of graduate degree programs. Or if you want to work in academia, you'll be expected to keep a CV. When you first graduate from your ASN, if you elected to try to create like a CV or if you had to create a CV for something, your CV and your resume would probably look like carbon copies of each other. But then as you got more education, you went into a graduate degree or something, if you started working in academia, the CV would change a lot and you would notice that it gets a lot longer and a lot more, yeah, a lot bulkier and stuff. So again, it's not something you have to know immediately for applying to the jobs you're likely to get after graduation, but it's something that you might be asked to create, especially as y'all start applying to bachelor's programs or beyond. And again, some of y'all might even want to go into academia. And yeah, that would be something that you'd be keeping and keeping up to date quite frequently. It would basically be your resume, but for academia, if that makes sense. So then a work history. This is another document that you usually submit when you're applying to a place. Oftentimes it'll just be an online form you fill out on their website. A lot of the stuff actually is just filled out online in a form. Um, Sometimes people actually complain because they say it asks them to submit a document as a resume, and then it just asks them questions in like a survey that's basically what they put in the resume, and they're like, "Why did I do this twice?" Um, and then similarly, you do all that for HR, and then ultimately you still end up handing in a physical copy to the manager. So a lot of the stuff can feel redundant, but that's just the nature of human resources at a lot of places. Um, so you probably won't keep a work history file or page or document that you're keeping up to date. It's just something you're going to fill out when you apply to places, but you might keep your own that you submit to places. This is a complete and detailed list of your previous employers. And you want to include the name and contact information for the individuals and organizations you worked for. You also want to try to include a description of your duties in that position, and usually this will all be asked for. Also, usually when you fill out a work history, they'll ask for the last 10 years of your work history. They might ask beyond that, but usually they're just looking for the last 10 years. And so again, that's not actually really complete, but it's just considered like that's what's relevant and recent that matters. If and I apologize for jumping around a little bit, but it just relates to work history. You know, if you have worked at a place that doesn't exist anymore. Um, you still want to try to list that, or if you work at a business that doesn't exist anymore or something like that, you can just try to put the contact information for the individual. Um, that maybe would have been able to vouch that you worked there, like a boss or a former manager or a coworker or something like that. Because again, you might have worked for a company. It's like the company doesn't exist anymore. There's no way you could contact them. But maybe there's somebody that you worked with or that worked for through that company who, yeah, they're not there anymore either, but they could they could speak to the fact that you worked there, right? If that's not the case, then it becomes a little more complicated. You just want to try to find some way to prove that you did in fact work there, right? Um, and the other thing, if you don't have a lot of recent work history. You want to be prepared to speak to that kind of thing, right? And so this kind of gets into the interview a little bit, and so that's why I say I apologize for jumping around. But if your work history is very sparse, or let's say that over the last 10 years you have like a 6-year gap where you weren't working at all, you want to be prepared to maybe explain why that is. Like, well, I was in school and then I had a child, and et cetera. You don't want to just say like, well, I was just sitting around doing nothing. Maybe you were, but you probably don't want to. You were probably doing something in that time. Maybe you were, you know, learning a new skill or helping your family with something, whatever it was you're doing. You want to be able to speak to that, right? So then finally, you might keep a professional portfolio. Now, again, this isn't necessarily required, but it can be useful. Portfolio is it's a portfolio. It's a binder that you might keep. It might be a physical document. It could also be like a website. A lot of people use websites. There are portfolio making websites where you can create like URLs to them and that has all your information. LinkedIn, the website, like the social media site, LinkedIn is kind of uh, half of a professional portfolio a little bit, and a lot of people use it. I don't personally. I know sometimes there are web applications like Canvas, for example, actually has a way that we as faculty can create portfolios within it, but then we're sharing it in Canvas. The point is, though, the portfolio is kind of a collection of all these documents and more. So it's trying to document your education and career in a much more thorough way. So it'll include things like your resume, your CV, maybe like work history or something. But then it's also going to include things like copies of, or even the original sometimes of your diplomas, of your transcripts, reference letters that you've received or recommendation letters that you've received. And so what I mean by that is when you're applying for a job or when you're applying to a program of study, oftentimes they require professional references, usually like three. Sometimes it's two, but usually it's three. And that means you need to get a reference letter or a letter of recommendation or something from three individuals. Oftentimes when you're first entering your profession, it's going to come from us, from your faculty that you've been working with, especially your clinical instructors. So you want to keep those as you get them because again, they can be used as you apply to places. You can set copies. Um, you also, I always tell people this, that when you get a reference letter recommendation, it's always good to kind of like prioritize people you've been working closely with. So your clinical instructors, especially, maybe people you've worked with a lot in class or lab. Sometimes I'll have students approach me for a reference letter, or they want me to fill out a recommendation or something through a specific company or organization they're applying to work at or something. And if I haven't had them in clinical, I tell them, I'm happy to do it. And I can speak to your abilities in some fashion, but I will not be able to speak to your clinical abilities because I wasn't there. And so that's usually fine, but it's just you want to prioritize people that can give a full picture of your skills, abilities, and stuff. So especially your transition instructors, the person who rounds on you in transition is oftentimes a good person. And again, people that haven't had you in clinicals, we can do it. We're happy to do it. It's just we won't be able to speak to your clinical performance exactly, but we can speak to your classroom performance or lab performance or something. So yeah, again, like clinical instructors, always really good. The other instructors here at the Santa Fe, they're fine to use. Um, but you probably want to at least have one or something from a clinical instructor. Um, and sometimes, we do teach clinicals, like I teach clinicals. So maybe if you had me, then it makes sense. But if not, then just know that you probably want one from a clinical instructor as well. If you have any written work from your school or otherwise, you might want to include that as well. Like if you maybe wrote something for a class that got a really high grade and was really well done. You might include that as an example of your work, kind of demonstrates like, hey, look, this is what I'm capable of. Any awards or honors. So if you graduate with honors, if you receive any awards while you're in school, or maybe even get awards while you're working or something, you can include those or copies of those in your portfolio. So again, it's just a way to demonstrate like all your achievements, right? And they're not always required, but again, it's a good thing to be able to send to people. And if you make one online, you can just share the portfolio link to whoever you're applying with. You can even include a link to your portfolio in your resume itself. And if you really want to be fancy, you can do things like, link it to a QR code. So you just put a QR code in your resume. It's easy to hand them, and you just make a bunch of copies and you can hand them out. And yeah, you can be very creative with these things. You don't have to, but again, if you're that type of person that you want to show off your skills and abilities and you're, really driven. Sometimes that's something that you want to show to your employers. Are like, hey, look at all the stuff I'm willing to go through to get a job. So you should hire me, right? It's just kind of your call. So the actual interviewing process, when you apply for a job that's going well, then usually you'll be interviewed by a manager or by somebody who has some kind of ability to hire or at least uh, winnie people out of the process or into the process, right? Like kind of drill down as to a smaller number of people. So you might go through one round of interviews or maybe even a few rounds of interviews with different people. But one thing to remember when you're going through the interview process and having an interview is you want to kind of know a little bit about the place you're applying to first. So the organization or the hospital unit or the health center or whatever it is, just kind of know a little bit about it. Try to know as much as you can about it ahead of time so that you can, one, ask questions about the organization, but two, you can kind of explain why you want to work there and what about it interests you and things like that, right? You want to show up early. My football coach used to say, early is if you plan to show up early, you're on time. If you plan to show up on time, you'll end up late. And if you're late, then you do push-ups. So you really want to show up early, especially with nursing, where our career is very dependent on time. Now, that being said, stuff does happen, but you want to be very proactive about it, right? So just like with us, if you're going to be late for class or something, you want to give us a warning as soon as you can when you know you're going to be late. You don't want to just kind of like show up and then tell us after the fact. In addition to showing up early, you also want to dress nicely. Um, Now, depending on where you're working and the situation you're in, you might not be able to. So, like, if you're interviewing while you're coming directly from clinicals or something, it's reasonable that you'd be in scrubs. So, in our profession, scrubs are oftentimes acceptable. But it just depends, if you're not coming immediately from a clinical setting or rotation or something, you probably want to try to dress, as nicely as you can. Um, you want to prepare questions of your own. So, you don't necessarily have to ask stuff you're not interested in, but you want to ask questions. So it's just some things you might want to ask. Um, what's the nurse patient staffing ratio like on the floor? What's the average experience level of the people on the floor? What kind of opportunities are there for advancement or education or training? You might also ask questions about payment, remuneration or benefits or things like that. They might not have them in the interview depending on what level of the interview you're at. But yeah, just anything you might be interested in. While you're interviewing, you want to be attentive, you want to have good posture, you want to, maintain eye contact, be assertive, confident. One trick I've always heard in terms of maintaining eye contact is don't look at people in the eyes. You pick one eye and just look at that eye, or you can look at their like middle of their nose or something. But if you try to look at both their eyes, then it comes across as a little like creepy. You want to sell yourself as best you can. You want to try to highlight your positives if they ask you questions, which they're going to, but you want to answer their questions, but you don't necessarily want to volunteer extra information. So sometimes they'll ask you something and it's like you want to answer it to the best of your ability, but you don't necessarily want to give them more info. So as an example, there's some things that, related to maybe how much you made at a previous job. Or it could be personal things like the fact that you're wanting to have another kid, and so you're going to be on paternity or maternity leave, that might not be something that you want to volunteer because, they might say, oh, they're going to have to be out of work for a month or two, even though I'm hiring them. So yeah, I'm not going to hire them. That kind of thing. You might not want to just volunteer. When you come, you want to try to bring your resume, your CV, and or your portfolio, even though they probably have an online copy because you submit it through their like HR website. It kind of does a couple things. One, the managers get a bunch of different applications, so it's oftentimes useful for them to have the physical copy like on their desk they have to look at and go through. And it also can kind of make you stand out from just like the 100 applicants they have on the online, portal system. It's like, oh, I've got these like 10 people that brought them into me, so they're looking at them more. And it just shows you're prepared, you come prepared and you're ready to do that kind of thing. You're thinking ahead, you're being proactive. So some questions that you should expect. These aren't necessarily an exhaustive list of things that you would expect. There's a lot more they could ask you, but these are just some very common ones or themes that you might see. So general questions about your work or education. Like if you have something listed in your work or your education, be prepared to speak to it. So again, if you have like a gap in your resume, if you haven't worked in a while, if you went back to school, why'd you go back to school? Things like that. I'll remember when I applied for this job, actually, when I became a full-time instructor here at Santa Fe, one of my interviews with at the time, the vice president of the college, he was in his office and he kicked his feet up and he went, huh. And I went, well, okay, he's going to ask me something. I said, what's got your mind? And he said, well, your grades were very good. Had like A's and then you went into nursing school and you had like B's and C's and then you got out of nursing school and went into your bachelor's and master's program and you had A's again. So what happened there? And I just said, well, have you been to nursing school? Because he had not. He was like a liberal science instructor, and I was like, so nursing school is really difficult. Makes you rethink a lot of things. You have to kind of change your mindset and your outlook, and the grading scale we use is a lot tougher. And also, I went to school here for my ASN, so here at Santa Fe. So, and I know our program is very rigorous. Um, but so, it's like I'm explaining to him why. And then I also said, and that's also why I think I'm an effective educator, because I was not a completely straight A student. I struggled when I first got into nursing school because I hadn't originally planned on being a nurse when I went into college. And, I did well in school prior to that, but nursing school was kind of a change up for me. And I needed to reevaluate like how I studied and prepared. And it made me really think about how I take tests and how I do this stuff in a way that I hadn't had to before. And for that reason, I think I'm able to, better help people that are also in that position that are maybe struggling. If we, but the people that got straight A's, I don't know that they necessarily need a lot of help because they're getting straight A's, but the students that have, B's and C's or sometimes even maybe are on the bubble, it helps to be able to come from that perspective and say like, yeah, hey, like this is what I was able to do, and these are techniques that can help you, and they work for other people, and kind of understanding the same maybe blind spots that I had, and I know them now, and I can help people. So that's an example of like when people ask you questions, sometimes even about like your weaknesses and stuff. That's actually, the third one there. What is a weakness or strength of yours? When people ask that, when they're like, "What's a weakness you have?" They're not asking that because they want you to say like, "Oh, I'm like, really." Really stupid, or like, oh, I'm late all the time. What they're looking for is for you to be able to self-assess. So, like another example, I've been asked, "What is a weakness you have before?" And so I used to say it's not accurate anymore, really, but I used to say, that I tend to procrastinate really badly. That's a weakness I have, and so one of the things I do to, you know, compensate for that is I set deadlines in advance of when the deadline is, so that I don't let myself basically like I basically give myself the stress of like no, it has to be done a week ahead of time, so that way I get it done a week ahead of time, and I basically don't allow myself to procrastinate, and for that reason I don't really see it as a weakness anymore, but for a while it was something I tended to do. And yeah, it's like when I was asked that, that's my explanation, because it's a weakness, but it's also I'm not just saying like, oh yeah, I have this problem. It's like here's the problem, and then here's one way that I compensate for it, right? You don't want to just answer like, what's your weakness? Oh, I work too hard. I care too much. Those are BS questions. If I heard that and I was interviewing somebody, I would say that's a ridiculous answer. They haven't really thought about it, right? Um, but being able to say, yeah, this is an actual weakness I have, and here are things I'm doing to try to manage it, that speaks to your ability to self-assess, but it also speaks to your ability to to try to fix weaknesses. You acknowledge them, but you're also trying to fix them, right? Similarly, kind of similar thing for when they ask you what are strengths of yours, although that's a little bit more straightforward, right? Why do you want to work here? Skip that one just because it kind of tied into that example I was given, but you know, that's also a really common one. Obviously, the reason you want to work there is because you want a paycheck. Um, but don't say that. It's more think of it, why do I want to work here, right? There's a lot of places you can get a job. As a nurse, there's many places you can get a job. You'll never want for work. You might not want the work, but you will never want for work. Um, and so, yeah, why are you applying for that specific place? And so that's also why you want to research the place you're going to be working at ahead of time. Like, oh, I feel like I can learn a lot here, or I hear the culture is really good, or I really enjoy this patient population. Be sincere. Don't be disingenuous or fake in your interview, but you know, be real. Like, what are the reasons you want to work there? Because there's got to be some reasons why you applied one place versus another, right? What are your professional goals? Are you trying to move on, trying to get education, trying to work here for a year and then leave? You want to be prepared to answer those kind of questions. They might give you hypothetical clinical situations and ask how you'd handle it. So again, not necessarily checking to see that you just know the right answer, but more to see how you problem solve, right? Like how you solve real world problems. There are also questions they might ask that are not job related, and you do not have to answer them. You have um, National Labor Relation Board protections that mean that you do not have to ask them. Having said that, you have to be able to prove that somebody didn't hire you on the basis of your answering those questions. And sometimes it can be like a he said, she said type situation. It's not easy to prove, but just so if somebody asks you like, oh, what's your religion? You don't feel like you have to answer that. Um, you can if you feel comfortable doing so, but things like your ethnicity, your personal beliefs, your political beliefs, your religion, how much money you made, if you're single, if you're wanting to have a kid, all that stuff. Do not answer those questions or do not feel like you have to answer those questions. Again, you can if you want. And especially if you put any kind of thing that references that in your resume or CV, like again, if you did volunteer work for your church, um, it's reasonable that then they might ask you about the church or the kind of work you did. So be prepared for that. But otherwise, yeah, those aren't really appropriate interview questions. And again, if they ask them, you can use your own discretion. You can answer them if you want, but do not feel pressured to. Oftentimes, it's not done maliciously. It's oftentimes just a case of, if you're applying here in Gainesville, where we're in school and working and everything. Gainesville's a relatively small town, and so everybody kind of knows each other a little bit, and so it's more just kind of seeing who you know, and maybe like, oh yeah, I go there too, or oh, I do this or I do that. So you know this person, so it's oftentimes innocuous. It's not meant to be like, uh, you know, trying to hurt you in any way, but just don't feel pressured to answer it. And you can just very politely be like, sorry, I don't really feel comfortable answering that in an interview. But outside of the interview process or outside of work, I'd be happy to discuss maybe with you or something, but yeah, just not in the interview process. And sometimes that can actually give you an insight into if that's the person you want to work for or not, if how they handle that kind of thing. Some questions you might want to ask yourself. And again, these aren't exhaustive. They're just examples of ones you might want to ask. Again, what's the nurse-patient ratio like? What's the experience level of the nurses on the floor? Because if you're a new nurse, you don't necessarily want to be on a floor where it's all other new nurses, right? How is your performance measured and evaluated? So what's going to determine how much of a raise you get? How are raises handled? Um, what kind of disciplinary action might you face if you don't meet your performance measurements? Um, that kind of thing is like can be important. And again, another anecdote: when I graduated, a colleague of mine ended up working on the same floor. So me and her both graduated the same year. We kind of knew each other in class, though not really, but we worked on the same unit and we talked and, we're friends. And, it came annual eval time and I got like a 4% raise. And I said, thank you. I'm happy. I will keep going. Because I was in school and doing a lot of other things and I wasn't like super worried about money. I mean, I obviously wanted more, but I was just like, I'm just keeping my head down, trying not to make waves, just doing my thing. And 4% is like it's like good, it's like, hey, good job. That was at the time anyway. That was like, good job. You did a good job. Congratulations. But the highest, the raise is capped out at 7%. And my colleague, she had like meticulously gone over the evaluation process and did everything she could to get that 7%. And so when it came time for her eval, she got a 6.5% raise. And the boss, the manager was like, "Here's your we did think you did a fantastic job. You're like a great nurse, and we can't wait to see what you're going to do here, and that's why we're giving you a 6.5% raise." And my colleague was like, "So why isn't it 7?" And she wasn't happy that she got like a 6.5, which was like higher than anybody else on the unit. It was like, "Well, why didn't I get the maximum?" And the manager's like, "Well, we want you to work for something." And she said, "Well, no. Here's my evaluation metrics. Can you tell me which one I didn't meet?" And she wasn't being accusatory, but she was just saying, "Hey, here's the metrics you gave me. Here's what I did. Can you explain to me how I didn't meet them so that I wouldn't get the 7% raise?" And after a few meetings over like a month or two, she got her 7% raise, and she kept filling me in on the drama behind it. And I just was like, kind of like looking the other way, like I just took my 4% and just kept my head down. But she got her 7% raise. And that's because she understood how she was going to be evaluated and how her performance was being measured. She made sure she hit all those benchmarks. So if that's something that matters to you, just keep that in mind. Um, any continuing education assistance, sometimes the job maybe it doesn't pay the best, but it has benefits that are really useful. Like, yeah, they help pay for your continuing education. And that can be huge, especially if you want to go in for education. Also asking questions about benefits and things like that. Again, what are the expectations of the position? It's kind of like how your performance is measured, but it also is like different floors and different hospitals and different units have slightly different expectations. So just as an example, in one hospital, it might be the norm that the um, nurse on the floor passes all their meds. On another hospital, they might use like a team-based approach where you have one nurse who manages maybe 8 patients, but they have a dedicated medication nurse who's passing all the medications for a team of nurses. So, it's like slightly different expectations, different positions, right? Even though you're trained to do all of it, it's like that's not what you're going to be doing on the job. There's things you might be trained to do that wouldn't be expected of you. There might be things that you haven't been trained to do, but they would be expected of you, and they're still within the scope of your practice and your license, but you would just need training to do them, right? So it's just that kind of thing. And then what's their orientation program like? How long do they spend with new graduates helping to orient them to the unit, to the hospital, or to the workplace? It might not be a hospital, but what does that look like? Is it a week and then you're on the floor on your own? Do they have a mentorship program? Do they have a preceptorship program? Do they have a nurse residency program? Some hospitals use something like that. It's really important because I always like to say that nursing school is really your prereqs to nursing school. And nursing school is really that first year or maybe even 2 years that you're a nurse. So, um, when you go into your first job, you're going to be learning as much, if not more, than you did during your time in nursing school. And for that reason, you want to make sure that you are um, treating it with that kind of, attention that you're approaching it like, hey, I have to learn a lot, and so I want to make sure I'm setting myself up for success, right? The job you get out of nursing school is going to be one where you learn the most, and it's probably going to shape a lot of your nursing practice. And, you probably, hopefully, want to have a long, happy, safe career in the field, and I want that for you too. So, try to make sure that the first job you get is one that's going to support you, that you're going to be able to orient effectively, that's not going to burn you out, that it's not going to lead you down bad habits or anything like that, right? So again, continuing on with interviewing, they might offer you a position in the interview. Every job I've ever gotten is I interviewed and on the spot I was offered the job. And that's not necessarily because I'm so great. I'd like to think that, but it's because of the demand for nurses. I can tell you none of my friends or family or relations outside of nursing have ever had that. But it is something that happens in fields like ours sometimes. And not saying it will happen to you, but if it does, do not feel forced to accept the position. You can take some time to consider it, especially if you're applying to multiple places. You might say, I can't accept right now. I very much appreciate the offer. I'm going to consider it. Is there a deadline by which you need my answer so that you can think about it? Because there might be things you want to still answer or ask, or you might be waiting to hear back on other places. Um, Another thing to just keep in mind as it relates to that is if you accept a position be prepared to work there. Don't accept a position and then basically cancel or take it back because you heard from somebody else. So something that can happen is maybe, like let's just say hypothetically, there's three hospitals in town, or at least major hospitals. There's North Florida, or HCA, there's the VA, and then there's UF Health Shands. So say you don't know where you're going to go after you graduate, you apply to all three, and HCA sends you an invitation. They say, hey, we want to hire you. You accept it. 2 days later, UF Health says, hey, we want to offer you a position too. And you say, oh, well, I'd rather have that position. So I'm going to call HCA and say, I'm not taking it, and I'm going to take the Shands position. So I'm not saying you can't do that. You can do whatever you want. But the thing is now HCA are going to see you as somebody who you said you're going to accept a position and you backed out on it. And that means now they're probably going to look at any future applications you might have quite warily, and it's going to kind of sour them on you. So, it's a small town. If you work, maybe something doesn't go well at the new job and you start looking again, they're going to be very hesitant to maybe hire you over at HCA. So it's just something to consider. One thing you can do if you get an offer from one place, and you're waiting on others, you can call those others and say, look, I just got an offer from this place. They gave me a deadline. So if y'all want to hire me, I need an offer by, this date, or else I'm going to accept that job. And that can kind of help speed that along. And that's another reason why you might say you want to wait to take an offer. Just if it's where you want to work though, I'm not saying don't take it. Like I said, the when I was offered jobs, I took them on the spot, but it's because I knew I was confident that's where I wanted to work. So every situation is different. I'm just saying, be prepared. Don't feel like you need to accept it. Make sure you know what the benefits package is for the position. That can affect a lot of things. It's how you make sure that you stay healthy and happy and cared for. You got to take care of yourself first and foremost. Make sure that you meet the manager and possibly some other staff you'll be working with. Oftentimes, the managers who you'll be interviewing with, or maybe the clinical leader. But if not, you want to make sure you meet them and kind of get a feel for the culture of the unit and everything. Because if not, you might get hired someplace and it turns out you really do not want to work there, right? And then after you interview, if you get the job, if you don't get the job, send a thank you letter after the interview. If you get the job, you probably don't need to send a thank you letter. You might, but you probably don't, because you'll be working there. But if you don't, or if you're waiting to hear back from them, send a thank you letter. And the reason you do this, again, you don't have to, but the reason you do this is one, while you're waiting to hear back from them, it can kind of be another sign that like, hey, look at how professional I am. I'm very respectful. I'm doing everything above board. I'm sending people thank you letters like I'm a solid hire. Um, but also maybe it's a situation where you didn't get a job. Maybe they didn't hire you. It can still be helpful to send a thank you letter because maybe they had 50 applicants for one position and you were number two on the list, but there was just one person that beat you out on it, right? You send a thank you letter, and you can even say something like, I hope you can keep me in mind for future positions or something. There might be another position that opens up, and they reach out to you, or maybe the person that took that position doesn't work out, and you'd be next on their list after a few months or something. So again, it can sometimes feel really bad to not get a job offer when you really wanted one. It can feel very personal and it can make you feel hurt. And, I can appreciate that. You're definitely welcome to that. Or it's understandable you'd have those feelings, right? But all I'm saying is try to put those aside and remember, like, hey, you want to try to maintain a link to them in some way because things can change. Your situation might change, their situation might change, and maybe there's another position that's waiting for you down the line, or maybe even that same position. It's just a way to kind of keep your options open, right? And again, can mean that maybe that person that didn't hire you, they didn't hire you and they don't have a position for you, but hey, maybe they know somebody and they're like, you know what, this person is really solid. And I wish we would have been able to hire them and the person we hired, but we couldn't. But hey, you have a position open in some other business or organization or something. Um, I would recommend them to you, like, hey, you should, or they might even recommend a place to you. So again, it's kind of like the networking side of things. You want to keep good relations with people. Um, yeah, and then kind of last thing, kind of related, kind of unrelated. social media. So a lot of people these days, pretty much everybody uses social media in some form or another. Be careful what you share and who you share it with, because all that stuff is viewable by anyone and everyone. So if you use social media, one, make sure that what you share is what you want people to be able to see about you. Usually, social media programs have and apps have settings that limit who can and who can't see things you post or what kind of content you post. Some people can see and other people can't see. So just be aware of that. Also be aware that again, not everybody's going to stay here locally, but a lot of y'all will. Um, again, Gainesville's a small town, it's a small area. Even if you set things to like your friends, you might end up actually being friends with some of the people that our coworkers and stuff. And, it'd be nothing for a boss to just be like, hey, I'm interviewing like somebody. I think they're a friend of yours. What's their social media like? That kind of thing. So just be aware of that. Monitor and protect your own privacy. Just kind of know what people can find out about you. And one thing I say could be helpful is use a search engine on your name, and your specifics, like you type in your name and your city you're in and stuff like that, and just see what comes up. Um, See what kind of information somebody could get about you. So, just as an example, I had a friend who, um, when she was younger, she was in a car accident and she was not the driver, but there were people that died in it and there was like a lawsuit over it and stuff like that. So when you Googled her name, there were all these news articles about like, oh, these people that died in a car accident and they were young and they were teenagers and they were being reckless and stuff. Um, and so yeah, it's like something that she had to be aware of that when she was applying for school or jobs that like her name would immediately come up with all these news stories. Similarly, like I know, if you Google my name, you can find out a lot of personal information about me. Um, and yeah, I'm aware of that. I've accepted that. I'm not like always pleased that it's the case, that anybody can find out stuff about me. But that's, I've kind of accepted that and I'm fine with it. But if I was applying for a job where I thought it might hurt my chances or something, it might prompt me to be a little bit more careful or protect or find some way to kind of like take down mentions of me because it might impede my ability to get a job or something. That being said, I personally kind of have a philosophy of like if it was going to prevent me from getting a job somewhere, I probably wouldn't want that job, but or work with those individuals. But I'm just saying you got to self-assess, you got to be aware, and it's a way to help you be more prepared when you're interviewing, right? It's a way for you to know like, all right, these are the kind of things they might know about me and they might be able to access. The big thing though is you don't want to put anything that might be inappropriate, that might reflect poorly on your ability to maintain HIPAA or to protect the institution, right, from like bad publicity or something like that. So yeah, so like I said, that's the end. Sorry for this ugly black screen, but that tells us we're over. Um, and yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. You can ask other instructors, and again, especially as you get closer to graduation. But just you can always refer back to this recording as well if it's useful. And yeah, just I know it's a long ways away, but good luck in the resume and interview process. And once y'all graduate, hopefully everybody lands in a position that not only it's going to make you happy, but also it'll help you develop more as a nurse and lead to a long, fruitful career in our profession. So yeah, have a good rest of your day.